So the final talk for the day, before we move on to the panel discussion, we have Christina Hoffman from Medscape, Gökhan Tanju, also from Medscape, and they're joined by Alessandro Pontes-Arruda from Sanofi. And those three are going to tell us about beyond knowledge transfer, and that's generating actionable insights for medical affairs. So I see one of you is presenting, and I'll hand over to all three of you, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. Our talk today, as you mentioned, is really addressing bringing value from the medical affairs function through actionable insights. What we'll do, just to give you a sense of the flow here over the next few minutes, is a call to action with Alex talking about medical affairs as our strategic pillar. The second section of the discussion will be data that's perhaps tortured, but nonetheless used to tell a story, and then compelling data to tell a story that matters. And that'll be some use case discussions that Alex and I will cover. So I will hand this over to Alex to go ahead and get us started with the medical affairs as a strategic pillar.
Thanks, Chris. Perfect. I have the next slide. First and foremost, I need to highlight here that things are really evolving, and medical is more and more being perceived as a strategic pillar for the pharma industry. However, with that comes a challenge that medical is actually in a position where it's not only being considered or given the opportunity to be a strategic partner, but actually need to provide evidence that is bringing value to the table. There are many debates within the different organizations on how we can use science to reinforce the value of medical affairs. However, one thing is for sure. In this complex world with multiple stakeholders, our ability to combine, analyze, and interpret the different data sets is becoming more and more critical. And actually, not only that, our ability to synthesize and digest complex pieces of information, really translating this into meaningful insights that are actionable, it's becoming very, very critical. Even more in this digital environment, and sometimes personally I do not like the word digital because it's such a broad world, and nobody knows exactly what it means, but definitely many of our stakeholders are suffering from these Zoom fatigue, and keeping having these teleconferences for nobody knows until when, is just not the perfect way to collect insights or to drive actionable items. But actually, we need to be very creative. That comes with some specific opportunities here. I'm talking about, using things like artificial intelligence and natural language processing that can really help us to digest information, especially if you have multiple or hundreds of different pieces of information to summarize, in order to really get, right to the point, straight to the point, and again, drive actionable items from the insights we collect. If I can get the next slide, Chris. So if you think about, the way medical is moving towards 2025 and our ability to really drive and improve patient experience and outcomes, and you think about kind of the four pillars over here, the first pillar for medical is really how we innovate in terms of evidence generation. That comes in a moment where, of course, things like HUR and traditional phase, 3B, 4 studies is still there. However, the utilization of real-world evidence databases, ability to, collect what happened with many of these products after they are launched and as they are adopted in the real world, is becoming more and more important. I believe you all know about, even the FDA guidance of considering real-world evidence to update labels and for indications, which is something that is very new and talks about the value of real-world evidence. But Other things like microanalysis and can help us to tailor the information that is needed for the individual patients. And that speaks about the second pillar over here, where we need to accelerate access to treatment. We need to work under the concept that one size does not fit all anymore, and we need really to look at the evidence and articulate not only the clinical but also the economic value of the therapies that are out there, making sure we are delivering the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. That leads to the way we transform and personalize medical engagement, and the moment you start thinking about individual patients and how individual patients will see value and benefit from the clinical standpoint, from standpoints like quality of life, from the therapies that are available. We also need to start thinking about how we're going to articulate this to maximize medical impact, injecting new capabilities really to upgrade performance, medical performance. And finally, these three pillars combined together are the perfect setup for setting up internal medical leadership and upgrading physicians and patient decision-making process, engaging providers, patients, and others to this tailored information that medical, when analyzing and driving insights from or driving actionable items for the insights we collect, can really provide. So we are in this crossroads over here, and my colleagues are going to speak, and Christina is going to give us some example. But before that, Gökhan's going to discuss some specific examples here. So off to you, Gökhan.
Right. So, and where Gökhan is going to take us, as Alex has really set up very nicely, is the need to bring value, the need to demonstrate impact. Gökhan is going to talk about the universal language of data in essence, and how can we unlock some value from that in order to tell a story. So Gökhan, it's on to you.
Hey, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Alex. Guys, I'm sure you've heard the saying that knowledge is power. But if you kind of think through that, it's actually the application of knowledge that's power. And as data scientists for data-driven decision-making, we need to present more than just the data. So we need to tell convincing stories and relatable stories to get stakeholders to act on these insights. And without this, we actually fall short. I'm going to tell you an abbreviated story about Ignaz Semmelweis to basically demonstrate this point. He was the first to discover that hand washing had life-saving power in a medical setting. He was a director of medicine at Vienna General Hospital during the 1840s, and this was a teaching hospital. The hospital had two wards, a maternity ward and a morgue. The maternity ward had two wings, one run by midwives, and then the other one was run by students and the doctors and their students. The major difference between the maternity wards that were run by doctors was the death rate. The death rate from childbed fever was 5 times more in the doctor's ward than the midwife's ward. Semmelweis was curious and wanted to figure this out and kind of understand why. This presented him with a perfect scientific experiment, a control group and a variable, which is basically the death rate. He started to make small changes to equate the practices in both wards, but these changes had no impact to the death rate. Remember, in the 1840s, germs had not been discovered, and it was still believed that disease was caused by miasma or bad air, and evidence-based medicine was just on the cusp of being developed. One thing he did notice was that doctors would perform autopsies in the morning in the morgue, and then pop up to the maternity ward in the afternoon to deliver babies or treat patients, but without washing their hands. He thought maybe bad particles are transmitted by touch. So one day, to add fodder to this theory, one of his friends a doctor was accidentally cut by a student during a dissection. And later, his friend actually died from the exact same childbed fever symptoms as the woman. So to test this theory, he instructed both wards to wash their hands and instruments, wash their hands and their instruments in a chlorine lime solution. And chlorine's an amazing disinfectant, and this would, in this way, this would interfere in the transmission. Following the implementation of this practice of this hand washing, the mortality rate dropped in the doctor's run ward, but from as high as 16% down to 1%. And in the midwives run ward, it actually dropped as well from 2% to 1.5%. So there was, the data actually showed that lives were being saved. Now, despite his success, that this insight of hand washing actually saved lives, there was great resistance from his peers and from the administration of the hospital. He was unable to explain why his technique was working. He was a terrible communicator. He was curt and would often get angry when challenged or questioned about his findings. So he basically made no friends in the medical community. And when political changes occurred, Semmelweis lost his job. Now, as soon as he left the hospital, and you can see that on the chart in the late 40s, the doctors and administrations actually stopped using this technique of hand washing, and the death rate shot back up to where it was before. Now, you can actually argue that the doctors and administration acted irrationally, but you can also argue that Semmelweis, if he had changed his approach and told a better story or a more relatable story, he might have saved more lives, which was his ultimate goal. So at Medscape, how do we tell better stories? Now, it starts with a sound data strategy for us to look for patterns in or signals that we can act on. To be able to discover and generate non-obvious insights, we start with a holistic data strategy. We fuse together data from first-party, second-party, and third-party data sources. This helps us enrich and extend our HCP demographic and behavior data, serving as the foundation to build and deploy modern analytical use cases. Our data domains include things like the HCP profile, prescribing activity, diagnostic activity, relevant content consumption around the particular condition, promotional engagement, and for our use case here, events data. Next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. So what types of stories do we tell? So we start with our audience. So you have to know your audience. We want to know everything about them. We segment and pivot on multiple dimensions like physician properties, practice settings, specialty geography, and other properties. We track this cohort across time in relation to an event. Events are key milestones because they can actually change behavior. We want to understand their impact on the cohort and also on the microsegment on the microsegments below them. We look back at their behavior prior to an event. We capture longitudinal sentiment, like likelihood to recommend, what you thought about that at the event pre and post in our event trackers, and follow through to track changes in post-event behavior. Based on this, we create both standard analytical packages that covered digital metrics like page views, day visits, time spent, top articles consumed, top search terms, and things of that nature. But we also look to detect changes in diagnosing and treatment behavior at the cohort level. I'm going to turn it over to Chris Hoffman to basically drill into how we act on these insights.
Thanks,
Chris?
Gökhan.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I appreciate it. So this section, which I think we're built up to in a way that seems logical, is using this idea of compelling data to tell a story. And I'm very specifically using compelling as a verb. We often use compelling as an adjective, right? Compelling data, like that means the data is compelling. But in many ways, I think in talking with medical affairs colleagues around the globe, the challenge is that getting the data to tell the story is the hard part. The data itself, there's vast amounts of data. It's not for lack of data that Med Affairs it suffers. It is for lack of the story that the data can help to tell, and a story that actually matters to the function, to the company, and to patients ultimately. So I'm going to go through, with Alex's help, three use cases where we're going to talk about events and data and the kinds of things that they can tell. So we'll use this format here. So I'll outline the data source. What was the finding and where did it come from? What is the actionable insight that can be gleaned from it, and who from the organization, the sponsoring organization, where there be implications. So, all right, so in this first one, we're going to look at diagnosis and prescription volume as the data source. So we can use IQVIA data here. The finding that we have is during a masterclass, which is an immersion disease state education, where there were 350 delegates, we are able to look at diagnosis codes for a therapeutic area of those delegates prior or run-in period prior to their coming to the event, and then for 6 months after the event. And again, while helpful, also looking at a control group, a matched control group that we can gather from IQVIA to look at the same timeframes. And in doing that, we find that the participants or the delegates actually increased their diagnosis codes, or ICD-10 codes that were being used. So what's the actionable insight from that? All that's very interesting, but what? So what? In this case, we can glean that this intervention worked. And in fact, this intervention then becomes an evidence-based resource and can be deployed against additional targets. So there's implications here to the medical affairs function, to the commercial function, and ultimately to patients. So Alex, what are your thoughts about this particular case?
I think this is extremely useful, especially, our colleagues on this call, they all know very well the limitations we have in terms of, legal compliance boundaries here to, link, medical affairs education to anything that is associated with sales of products and so on. But this is a great example that gives us the ability of really demonstrating some key impact indicators, key metrics here, without necessarily the link between sales and the medical activity, which can really demonstrate the value of the medical affairs organization, and at the same time being compliant with the regulations. So examples like this can be really useful. Many times we have this endless debates about medical investing on education, and of course supporting educational events. And when we sit all around the table, including with our commercial folks, is always, okay, what is the value of this, right? Why are we investing so much money in this effort? This is exactly a very good example on how we can be very creative and demonstrate with interventions like this and actionable insights like this the value of the medical organization.
Right, so evidence is the basis of all in medical affairs, ultimately. Let's go to the next case. So in this case, we have something that has happened at another course. So in this course, we delivered a evidence, or a case study rather, and a discussion ensued on that. And then at the end of the case study, participants were asked questions about some clinical guidelines. And we were able to then, going back to what Gökhan was talking about, look at a pivot between the geography and answers to the case-based question. This pivot showed that delegates that were corresponding to MSL Jones, in air quotes here, MSL Jones territory, were confused about the clinical guidelines. What are the actual insights here? First of all, there's a need to consider or look at MSL Jones specifically to make sure that he or she is up to par and is on point. MSLs are trusted and they are respected sources of information in their territories, and so this might be the first thing to look into, is ensuring that this person is on point. The second would be the opportunity to tailor some resources to close the gap with this territory, and those would need to be assessed a bit further, but it gives a starting point for that. This has implications to the medical affairs function, obviously, and depending on the findings, potentially could have an implication with human resources. And then really very closely are the patients of the clinicians that are in MSL Jones territory. So Alex, your thoughts about MSLs and their value and monitoring in this way?
Thanks, Chris. This is another good example. I think you already addressed 2 key points over here regarding this MSL performance here that are directly related to the insights from this activity, and obviously these are pretty straightforward insights and actionable insights. However, this also brings me back the idea of how important we are, how important medical organizations are in terms of disseminating the right scientific information, and how much the opinion leaders and the HCPs out there rely on medical organizations to disseminate the scientific information. So it definitely also speaks about the need of assessing how the information is being disseminated, how effective the MSLs are tailoring the information to the right physician. Again, we need to work under the principle that one size does not fit all, and therefore different HCPs are at different levels of knowledge, and that's absolutely drug agnostic, independently of whatever segment you are talking here. There's a need for customization, and an additional potential actionable item here is to see if it is merely a problem related to MSL Jones as an example here, or is it something broader that can be done in terms of digesting and dissemination of the information.
Right, so that's the second case. Thank you for your insights. The third case here really is taking a look at some of the additional avenues and angles that Gökhan was referring to. So we talked about the N of 1 in the second case about MSL Jones, or a geography that might have some implications for tailoring. Now we're going to kind of reverse that funnel and talk about it in a broader way. So what is the implication to a bigger set? In this scenario, we are looking at post-event consumption patterns of news, reference, and education on the site Medscape. And that data is looked at in the after event of peer-to-peer facilitated disease state education events. In this case, there were 5 different speakers and 50 different activities ultimately, but looking at the participants that were involved with any one of these activities as a cohort, and then assessing their behaviors on Medscape specifically. And in this case, 40% of the participants performed search on Medscape around a differential diagnosis. This is in the reference section on the site, and this was done within 3 months of the event. So what this tells us is that there is some need here. This alert will alert us that and give us an opportunity to alert commercial colleagues to deploy some additional resources, be those staff or collateral development. Then there's also this opportunity, as I foreshadowed a little bit too, of looking at the similarities of the clinicians that meet this need. In other words, using artificial intelligence, AI techniques to find those clinicians that look like those that are experiencing this sort of additional need for more information and so forth. The implication here certainly for commercial and ultimately for patients. Alex, your thoughts here?
Yeah, this is a very interesting one, and this also speaks, Chris, about retention, right? And the need of continuously reinforce the message, and even if you manage to digest the information, digest complex information, it's never once and done. There is a need of reinforcing the message all the time if you really want to people, the HCPs, to retain that. And this partnership, of course, between medical and commercial is critical. And I think the other actionable insight here would be, a way to keep demonstrating the need of reinforcing message and investing definitely on education.
Thank you. So we are at the point here where we are for questions and answers over. So I'll stop sharing and we can go back to a face-to-face discussion. Are there any questions?
I don't have any in the chat currently.
I have one. Jeff here.
Oh, yeah.
I'll just turn my video on. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks, Alex, Gökhan, and Chris for a very insightful talk. I've never had 3 people speaking in one speaker slot. 2 is very common, but 3, so wow, very smooth. Well done. Yeah, so we had some pre-submitted questions come in. Sometimes they're anonymous, so feel free to own up if this is your question. But how do you utilize data collected from physician interactions? Very broad question, but how can you do that?
Right. So there's a number of layers to that question, right? So Gökhan did a nice job of saying really about all of that, the kinds of information that we have access to, and I think it's important to discuss that piece of it. And we also, in the previous speaker, talked a little bit about privacy and what can we say and what can we do, and in different geographies, those are different answers. But what we're talking about in the United States is the opportunity to use data that helps us understand the clinician's behaviors, and those behaviors are pretty rich in terms of the kinds of things. And again, going back to what Gökhan was mentioning before about whether it's time, the topics, and if we just think cognitively about when you perform a search on anything, what does that say? It says you don't know something, right? I mean, you don't search things you know well. That's the case. So putting a search and going into in this case Medscape for a search can be quite illuminating, especially if there's patterns of searches that are occurring across specialties or across cohorts that participate. So I feel like there's a lot of data there, and that's that kind of first and second party data that Gökhan was talking about, and then marry that to third-party data, because then the richness of the story, and we'll use the omni-channel graphic that was used at the previous speaker, when you can start to bring in all of those data points together and have them coalesce to tell a non-obvious thing, right? Any of us can look and say, oh, well, this specialty did this and that specialty did that. And while that could be helpful, it's not that hard to assess. There are patterns that exist that aren't obvious. And so getting answers to or giving answers that come from looking at those patterns is really what we're talking about here. And how can we tell a powerful story that gives an implication, an actionable insight to the supporter of the content as well is important.
Great. I heard I saw an interesting definition that in medical affairs, people confuse an observation, as you just said, as an insight, and then not necessarily an insight. So it needs to be taken further, and it may never become a good insight.
Right.
And there was one more pre-submitted question. What are you hearing from physician members about their virtual experiences in the last year, and also, do they have some sort of desire to go back to the live meeting format, or what are your thoughts in the future?
Go ahead.
Oh, feel free, Chris. I can comment on that. I would say yes, they are 100% very tired of this virtual environment. However, that comes with a challenge. I, of course, as part of my duties, I'm in contact with the major associations here in the United States for the cardiovascular space, and they are facing a challenge now, which is I never thought about that. On one side, all the physicians pretty much and the HCPs overall are poking the organizations to come back to live events because they are all vaccinated. They are all frontline workers, right? So they are asking to go, okay, we're ready, we can come back. However, the staff and the people providing services and on the conference, they are not. So now they're struggling with the situation where the HCPs are, okay, we're ready to go. Where are the congresses? And the organization is still not there. So hopefully, this is a worldwide problem, of course. Different countries are at different stages of vaccination. Most of the countries right now prioritize healthcare and frontline workers. So I bet this is true as well for other regions of the world. But yes, people are very tired, and therefore there is a need here to start engaging them differently, and not only through Zoom and Teams and these types of platforms. There are many ways you can engage people. Right now, I'm particularly exploring things like fireside chats and even digital publications and things like that can really help us to keep people engaged and relieve a little bit of the so-called Zoom fatigue while we navigate through this way back to normal.
One thing I'll amend to what Alex has just said as it relates to this the big miss right now in the digital space, or the exclusively digital space, is not having interaction with each other. So clinicians have told us that, I'm missing the chats that I've had in the halls at congresses, those things that aren't scheduled. Nobody puts it as an agenda item on a Zoom meeting to talk about your golf game or your travel. And I know that seems petty in some respects, but in reality, connections with people, and especially KOLs, where they are hearing from people that they would not otherwise hear from unless they happen to be kind of bumped into in the hallways, about collaborations on studies, which maybe is a little bit more meaningful to this audience, but in reality, it's the human aspect that has been missing. So looking for opportunities, as Alex said, to just connect people to each other and have the discussions that they would otherwise have in real life is what we have to try to create in the digital space to meet that need.
And just a final comment, you are right on spot, Chris, the networking. But for us as medical affairs, collecting sites, the face-to-face contact makes a difference, because there is a component here that is the body language, right? We don't have this anymore. And I'm not talking about advisory boards or even in advisory boards. It's so difficult to read between the lines when you are in Zoom meetings, and it's just impossible. I'm talking about those little conversations we have at the corridor during the conference, and the body really speaks, and we no longer have that ability, and that's a huge source of insights for us as a medical organization, and overall as human beings. I'll give you the perfect example. The year before, I was in the European Society of Cardiology conference in Paris, where they release some of the latest results on the SGLT2 programs and the impact on cardiovascular outcomes. And then in the conference, there was was a late breaker. The data was presented, and then the reaction of the audience was a standing ovation for a Kaplan-Meier curve. That was the first time in my life that I saw a standing ovation for a Kaplan-Meier curve. We cannot have this anymore. And that really speaks about how people will accept the data and how people are willing to use that data to change practice. We cannot have standing ovations in Zoom meetings. So that makes a difference.
Indeed.
Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
And I think
running out of time, but go ahead.
Yes, I was just going to say, I think that's actually a good segue into saying thank you very much, all three of you, for your presentation. And on behalf of the audience, I applaud you.
Thank you.
Thank you.